This is an important time for discussions of younger and older generations in the United States. There are two profound changes happening that are causing generational differences all around us. These two changes are bigger than many people realize. One is a change in life stages, the addition of a life stage called emerging adulthood. I'll talk about that change in the third video in this series. The other change, the bigger force of reality that's rocking our world, is a shift to late modernity. I'll discuss that change in the second video in this series. In this video, though, we need to start by identifying the generations, see the great divide between the younger and older generations, and understand why the names that we're using to describe these generations are basically useless. Now, do keep in mind that these videos are my contribution to a large discussion. There's a huge literature about these topics, and my videos here are just based on my conclusions logically derived from the literature I've read and the data I've collected from over 18,000 college students from around the United States. While the facts I cover are widely accepted, there are many possible conclusions about what they mean. These videos are my conclusions, and I invite you to engage in conversation with these conclusions. Now let's take a look at the generations in the United States and how to discuss them in a useful way. There's a profound divide between the younger and older generations in the United States as I create this video in 2020. We don't want to get carried away here. The older and younger generations are more alike than different, but there is a profound divide, and anyone wanting to work across the line between younger and older generations needs to understand it. Unfortunately, most folks are busy discussing generations with names like millennials and Gen Z, while missing the larger forces that are the reason for the differences in older and younger generations. Those names are causing us to not see what's happening all around us. In the United States today, there are basically 6 different generations. The GI generation, the silent generation, the boomers, Generation X, the millennials, who are also known as Generation Y, and Generation Z. Referring to generations implicitly starts us talking about birth years. And birth years define cohorts that experience cohort effects. People who are born at a particular place and time share particular experiences that shape who they are. This is different than what we would call life stage effects. That's when people act and think in particular ways because they're at a certain stage in life. For example, we expect children to act and think in particular ways because they are at the stage of life we call childhood, which hasn't always looked the same across the centuries. The generational divide in the United States right now is primarily caused by a cohort effect. That and the fullness of that is what we're going to discuss partly in this video, but mostly in the next video. The life stage effect that matters for the generational divide today will also be discussed, but that'll be in the third video. If we consider the birth years from 1900 to 2020, we can identify 6 generations based on cohort effects. First, born between roughly 1900 and 1924 is what we call the GI generation. These folks were born during World War I or the Depression and were adults in World War II. If you ever wanted a perfect example of a cohort effect, this is the generation that demonstrates it. The World Wars and the Depression shaped them in ways that are more powerful than later generations can sometimes understand. Then comes the silent generation. They were born between roughly 1925 and 1945. These folks were children in World War II and learned to serve the greater good silently and dependably, or so they are called the silent generation for. Third, we have the infamous boomers. There are a variety of cohort realities this group could be named after. The Vietnam War, the Civil Rights era, the counterculture of the 1960s. But really the most important cohort experience these folks had was being part of the baby boom. The boomers were part of an extra large cohort of children created through a demographic increase in birth rates. It wasn't that there were lots of women having children. It was that women were having lots more children each, on average. And being part of this extra large cohort of kids changed the experience of these folks in ways that contributed to the way they approached all the events that happened later in their lives. That brings us to the other side of the divide. We begin with Generation X, born between 1965 and 1979. As you've seen, the GI generation, the silent generation, and the boomers have been named in ways that help us at least a little bit understand the cohort effects that made them who they are. But what does Generation X tell us? Mainly it tells us that this name was created for convenience and it's basically useless. Generation X is like a placeholder variable name. This is X. The same for Generation Y, born between roughly 1980 and 2000. They're also known as the millennials. Now, calling them Generation Y tells us nothing about the cohort realities that define them, and calling them millennials isn't any better. They got this name because they were born around the millennium. It's sort of like saying they're the year 2000 generation because they were born around the year 2000, which tells us nothing about the cohort effects that shape them. And finally, on the younger side of the divide, we have Generation Z, the current birth cohort, who also have a useless name. It might be neat for folks writing blog posts and trying to sell pop culture books, but calling generations X, Y, and Z doesn't have any sociological use for us. It doesn't help us understand what's happening in terms of cohort effects so that we can work across the divide between the younger and the older generations. So let's fix that. Let's make sense of generations X, Y, and Z in a way that helps us understand the profound differences between the older generations, the boomers and older, and the younger generations, Gen X and younger. The divide between the older set of generations and the younger set of generations is caused by the shift in American society from an early modern society to a late modern society. This is the big point. This shift, like all large shifts in society type, is based on the interaction of three factors. First, the physical environment the society exists in has a lot of effect on the reality that people experience when living in it. Second, the technology that's used at a given time also shapes the society. And third, the social structure and the culture of the society, what I'm going to collectively call the social arrangements of the society, also affects how people live and who they are. All three of these factors interact, and the changes in each one leads to changes in the others. The three together commonly reach relatively stable forms that we call society types. Let's go back to our scale of birth years. But let's lay it down as a timeline and look at some society types. Back when, agrarian societies generally had social arrangements with more centralized kinds of political systems, more mercantile types of economies, and arranged families where people lived in extended family groupings. In Europe, the environment allowed for beasts of burden as a power source, something that the environment in other places like South America didn't allow, and a food production technology based on the use of the plow. This interaction of social arrangements, environmental factors, and particular technologies created something we would call an agrarian society. Then came the time of the greatest change in human societies. We call it the Industrial Revolution. It's based on the interaction of the technological changes and the social arrangement changes that created industrial society. More broadly, we can think of the Industrial Revolution, though, as the beginning of modern society. Modern societies have social arrangements that are more democratic, less centralized political systems, more capitalistic, which is a big change from mercantile systems, societies that use science as the basis of advancing knowledge, and societies that have family systems based on the nuclear neo-local family instead of arranged marriages and extended families. The power source from the environment in modern societies is based on fossil fuels, and the technology is distinct from the technology of agrarian societies. Now that difference in technology is the focus of the rest of this video, and it's going to allow us to make sense of the generations. But we don't want to put too much emphasis on this. Remember, the shift from early modern to late modern society is the point here for the younger and older generations' differences. And the technology may be a handy way to label parts of it, and it's very important, and we'll discuss it here, but it is not the overall biggest point we need to make. Simply put, the older generations grew up in early modern society, what we can call the machine age, while generations X, Y, and Z grew up in late modern society, what we could call the computer age. Let's look at this in a bit more detail. Here are some major technologies that occurred in the last 120 years. Now, if we map the generation cohorts onto this timeline, we see the difference between the machine age generation technologies and the computer age generation technologies. GI generation landed in the times of automobiles, telephones, landline telephones, and radios. The silent generation in a similar circumstance. The boomers were at the beginning of televisions and transistor portable radios. And then with the Gen X, Gen Y, and Gen Z generations, we see a shift in the kinds of technologies involved. The technology that Gen X experienced could reasonably give us basis to call them the computer generation, since computers of every type became widely available in their birth cohort. Gen Y, the millennials, could reasonably be called the internet generation. And Gen Z could reasonably be called the cloud generation. The point here is that when these people were born, what they grew up with, what they thought of as normal, is different than what the earlier generations grew up with and thought of as normal. Now these names, computer generation, internet generation, cloud generation, actually tell us something key about the defining cohort effects that are shaping those people. They grew up in a world where computer-based technologies changed the way life is lived. Here then are the current living generations in the United States. The older generations are early moderns. They grew up in the machine age. Their fundamental understandings of reality were shaped by industrial society, and they could be called industrial natives. Now, the younger generations are late moderns. They grew up in the computer age, and their fundamental understandings of reality were shaped by digital society, and we could call them digital natives. Now, all of them are moderns. I'm going to set aside for some other day a discussion of postmodern or discussions that are around now about the fourth industrial revolution, because all of those statements have some utility, but they actually mislead us more than help us to understand what's happening. The younger generations are late moderns. The older generations are early moderns. They all are moderns in terms of post-agrarian society type. Now this is the basis for the great divide between the younger and the older generations. And notice that the older generations have adopted many of the ways of life of the younger generations, that is, they have moved into the late modern society. But their fundamental ways of understanding reality are based in early modern society, and they live as if they are visitors from a different society. Older folks make sense of life through the understandings of industrial natives, and younger folks make sense of life through the understandings of digital natives. Each group frames questions and answers differently, and can't understand why the other group doesn't make sense. Let's make sure we see how powerful this is. Think about the effect personal computers have had on how we live. If you're in the older generations, you remember the time before personal computers, and you remember how it changed everything from then, think about your life in the 1960s or 70s, compared to now in the 2010s, 2020s. Everything really does work differently. Think about the things we do now we couldn't do before computers. Think about how they changed the way we do everything at home and at work. And now, think about the effects of the internet. This has changed our lives probably even more than just having personal computers or work mainframe computers. The world has opened up for us in powerful ways. Now, digital natives take all of this as normal reality, as real as the tides, as real as gravity. Everything has always been like this for them. While we're at it, we should consider how the ability to carry a little computer around with us everywhere we go has changed the way we live. Even if we're just having the ability to always be in touch through phone and texting, this has huge effects on our lives. Those of us who lived in older generations and remember going on long trips or just being around town and never having a way to get hold of other people except finding a payphone, realize how different reality was from being able to text instantaneously from anywhere at any time. Now think of the realities that the cloud has made possible. I don't think we even have a good sense at this point of the real consequences of the cloud for who we are and how we live, but we're beginning to have a sense of it. The advent of computers, the advent of the internet, And the creation of cloud and app-based realities is the basis for the difference between the older generations who are industrial natives and the younger generations who are digital natives. But here's the extremely important point. Technology definitely matters, but it's only a part of the story. The profound differences between the older and younger generations is because of the shift to late modernity. Technology is only a part of that. It's an important part, and it can help us understand the cohort effects that created the younger generations. It is the more popular part to talk about. But we need a bigger and better understanding of the larger cohort realities. We need to understand what makes the younger generations so different from the older generations, and that means looking more broadly at the social arrangements particularly involved in late modernity. That's the focus of the next video.